The man who said it stood on a mud shelf 20 feet from the gate, backlit by a bank of work lights nobody had switched off yet, and he said it loud enough that the flagger, the two labourers unspooling caution tape, and the pickup driver idling behind her all heard every word. It was 6:40 in the morning on the third Tuesday in October in Kingsbridge, Massachusetts, and the air off the Passaquin River smelled like wet iron and cold diesel. Behind him, 612 feet of new steel bridge lay across the water in 4 spans. Girders painted a dull, weathering brown. A crawler crane parked mid-structure with its boom laid down for the night. Delphine Achterberg did not answer right away. She had learned, a long time before that morning, that the first thing out of her mouth was almost never the useful thing. She set the brake on her chair, pulled her gloves tighter at the wrist, and looked past the man at the bridge, because the bridge was the reason she had driven 90 minutes in the dark with a thermos between her knees. The structure was bridge number 20K4, the Vesey Narrows replacement, a federal aid project carrying 2 lanes over the river and, more importantly, over the 2 active tracks of the Merrimack Valley commuter line beneath the 3rd span. 18,000 vehicles a day were scheduled to cross it starting in December. 11 trains a day already ran under it. "I'm here for the 8 o'clock," she said. He tipped his chin toward a modular office set on cribbing with 3 wooden steps up to the door and no ramp anywhere near it. Then he smiled, wide and friendly, the way men smile when they are being cruel in public and want witnesses to think it was a joke. Neither. Dorsey Hallenbeck was the general superintendent for Trell Hallenbeck Constructors, a 4th-generation heavy civil outfit out of Worcester, and he had been building bridges in the Commonwealth for 31 years. He carried a bolt in his right hand and walked it across his knuckles as he talked. He was the kind of man who had one voice for the crew and another for the owner, and he had not yet decided which one she got. He decided while she waited, he said, coming down off the shelf, boots sucking in the clay. "They told me somebody was coming out to look at the paperwork." He glanced at the flagger, then at the labourers, and let a beat land. "Look, I'm going to be honest, because I don't have time to be polite. 40 minutes ago, I had a man go to the ER because he stepped in a form tie hole. That's a guy with 2 working legs and 11 years of experience." The flagger looked at her boots. One of the labourers made a noise into his coffee. Dorsey Hallenbeck laughed. It was a big, generous laugh, with nothing generous in it, and it went on a half-second too long, and then he turned to the crew and spread his arms, as if introducing an act. "Boys, we got oversight today." They kept her at the gate for 41 minutes. She timed it, because she timed everything. At 7:22, a project engineer came down and asked her to sign a visitor log balanced on the hood of a truck. At 7:31, she was told the 8 o'clock coordination meeting had been moved to 7:15 and had already adjourned. At 7:40, a young man in a green hard hat was sent over to escort her, and he was the first person on that site who looked her in the eye. "Teodoro Baldacchino," he said. "Teo, Quality Control Tech." He bit the inside of his cheek. "Then let's go to the north abutment, and then I want to be under the 3rd span, and then I want to get to deck level." "The lifts." He stopped, started again. She had been on 1,100 bridges and laughed at on maybe 400 of them, and it always came from men who mistook a chair for a verdict about what she could see. What none of them ever understood was that a person who lives at 41 inches off the ground spends her whole working life at the exact elevation of a bottom flange, a bearing seat, a splice plate, a bolt head. Everything that kills a bridge lives down low, in the mud, at the height of a seated woman's eyes. Dorsey Hallenbeck had just spent 41 minutes keeping the only person on the property who was looking at the right elevation out of his job site. He would spend the rest of his career trying to explain that decision. Delphine Achterberg had grown up in a triple-decker in Fall River with a grandfather in the back bedroom who had been an ironworker for 38 years and had come off the iron in 1979 with a hip that clicked and a hearing loss he refused to admit to. Anselm Achterberg had bolted up water towers, a stadium, 4 bridges over the Taunton. He was not a warm man, he was a precise one. When she was 9 and bored, he taught her to sound a bolt. He would set a length of angle iron across 2 sawhorses in the driveway, run a bolt through it, snug the nut with a wrench, and hand her a small brass hammer. "Tap it," he said. "Now listen." Then he would back the nut off half a turn and say, "Tap it again," and the sound changed. A properly tensioned bolt in a tight joint gave back a short flat click, like a tooth on a tooth. A loose one gave a dull tick, with a little life at the end of it, a hint of ring, because there was nothing squeezing it quiet. She could hear the difference by the end of that first summer. By 11 she could hear it in a joint with paint on it. By 14 she was doing it with her eyes closed, because he told her the eyes lie first. In 1981 her grandfather lost a partner in Providence. A man named Wendell Poy fell 40 feet when a beam rolled off a seat held by 4 bolts instead of the 8 the drawings called for, and all 4 had come out of a keg that sat in a mud puddle for a season. The investigation blamed the connection. The company blamed the dead man. Anselm Achterberg came home, sat in the driveway with a beer he did not drink, and said the only sentence of his she would ever repeat out loud. "Steel never lies, Delphine." She was 15. She wrote it on the inside cover of a spiral notebook, and then on the inside cover of every field book she ever owned after that, 41 of them by the fall she rolled up to the gate at Vesey Narrows. She took a bachelor's at UMass Lowell and a master's in structures at Lehigh, where she spent 2 years in a fatigue lab pulling steel details apart until they cracked. At 26. At 27, she was a resident engineer under a temporary falsework tower during a concrete placement in central Pennsylvania when a screw jack on the northeast leg lost its footing on undocumented fill and the tower walked. She was under it for 9 hours and 11 minutes. 2 ironworkers, Marcus Dietz and Peter Oval, died in the first 4 seconds, and she did not learn their names until a week later in a hospital in Harrisburg, because for the first week she was not conscious enough to ask. They saved her life and most of her spine. Below the 11th thoracic vertebra there was not much left to save. She was 28 when she came back to work, 30 when she stopped apologizing for the chair, and 32 when the Federal Highway Administration hired her as a bridge safety engineer. Because a woman who has been under a collapse develops an unshakable interest in why they happen. By 44, she was the division's lead structures engineer for construction oversight, one of 11 people in the country on the National Fracture Critical Peer Review Panel, and the primary author of a 19-page technical procedure on the field verification of high-strength bolted connections in fracture critical members. Her name was in the footer of every page of it. There was a laminated copy of pages 4 and 5 of that procedure tacked to the corkboard in the Trell Hallenbeck field office trailer, 11 feet from Dorsey Hallenbeck's desk, and it had been hanging there for 9 months. He had never once read the footer. The first day at Vesey Narrows, Delphine got as far as the north abutment and the mud beneath the 3rd span, and no farther. Teo Baldacchino came back from the office to say the man lift was tagged out for a hydraulic leak until Thursday, and he delivered the news to a spot 2 feet left of her head. "Thursday," she repeated. He bit his cheek. She wrote the date and the time in her field book, and the words "lift unavailable," and the initials of the man who had said it. "Show me the mud, then." They went down the Hall Road on the east bank, and it took her 11 minutes to cover 400 feet of rutted crusher run, and Teo did not offer to push, which she noted and did not mention. Under the 3rd span the ground was a churn of clay and standing water. Overhead, 90 feet across, 2 plate girders ran out over the commuter tracks, 96 inches deep in the web, and at the pier they were joined by field splices, stacked plates sandwiching the flanges, and through those plates, bolts, 112 at each flange. Silver-headed in the low sun, silver, Delphine sat in the mud under the third span of a bridge over an active railroad and looked up at 480 silver bolt heads, and her hands went cold inside her gloves. "Teo," she said, A490. He looked up. He looked for a long time. Then he looked at her and said nothing at all, which was, she thought, the most honest thing anybody had said to her since she got out of the car. The readiness meeting for the deck placement was the following morning at 7, and by then somebody had laid a sheet of plywood over the 3 steps as a ramp, at what she estimated was a 22-degree slope, roughly triple what any code in the country allowed. She went up it under her own power, because she had decided at 30 that she would never again be lifted in front of a crew unless a building was on fire. There were 22 people in the trailer: the mayor's public works liaison, the state's resident engineer, 2 people from the design consultant, the pump contractor, the crane superintendent, 10 of Dorsey Hallenbeck's people, and Teo in the corner with his field book. They had put her chair at the back, behind a support column with a sightline to exactly half the screen. "Since we've got a guest," Dorsey said from the head of the table, "let's do introductions. Delphine Achterberg. Right, Federal." He turned to the room and delivered the line like a punchline. 2 people laughed, not the state's resident engineer who studied the table. "I'm not here about hiring," she said. "I'm here about the splices at Piers 2 and 3, and I'd like 4 things before this pour goes on the calendar. The mill test reports for the bolt lots, the rotational capacity test results. The room got very quiet in the specific way rooms get quiet when everybody knows something." "That's proprietary," Dorsey said. "Mill certs on a federal aid contract aren't proprietary. Neither are quality control records." She had her pen on the page and did not raise her voice, and afterward more than one person in that trailer would say the flatness was worse than shouting. "You can hand them over this morning, or I can request them formally through the district, and the second way puts a date stamp on your refusal." He walked the bolt across his knuckles once, twice. "You'll get what I can put together," he said. There it was. 16 witnesses would remember that sentence. She got 4 pages. 4 out of what should have been 300. A transmittal, 1 mill test report photocopied so many times the heat numbers were furred at the edges, and 2 daily reports out of a series of 41. When she asked for the rest, the QC files were in a banker's box in a truck, and the truck was in Fitchburg until Thursday. When she asked to get to deck level at 1, the man lift had come back into service at 12:15, been moved to the west approach, and the operator's keys were in Dorsey Hallenbeck's pocket. She watched him take them out and set them on the trailer's window ledge, in plain sight, before he went out to the deck without her. That afternoon a photograph went around the crew's group chat, taken from behind, from the top of the abutment. A woman in an orange vest at the bottom of a plywood ramp with her front wheels off the ground, and a caption somebody had added in white letters. She would not learn what it said for 11 days, and when she did, she would not repeat it, and it would not be the reason she did anything. On Friday morning, Trell Hallenbeck held a topping-out breakfast on the East Bank, because the last girder had been set on Thursday night, and there is a tradition, older than any man standing in that mud, of putting a tree on the last piece of steel. There were 46 people there, 2 folding tables of catering trays, the mayor of Kingsbridge, a reporter from the Kingsbridge Ledger named Naomi Okafor with a recorder in her coat pocket, and a small evergreen wired to the top flange with orange ribbon. Delphine arrived at 6:50 and found the entrance to the pad blocked by a flatbed delivery of bridge rail posts, parked at an angle, its trailer wheels squarely on the only compacted path from the parking area. 20 feet of pumping clay on either side. She sat there 4 minutes working out the geometry, then took the clay, and it took her 14 minutes, and she arrived with mud past her elbows and both wheels packed solid. Dorsey Hallenbeck saw her come in, and his face did something complicated for a quarter of a second, and then he committed. "There she is," he called, and he raised a coffee. "Ladies and gentlemen, our federal oversight." They gave her a hand. 46 people, some of them uncomfortable, most of them just going along, applauded a woman covered in mud, and Naomi Okafor did not applaud and did not write anything down, and put her hand in her coat pocket and turned the recorder on. "Now," Dorsey said, warming to it, "I want to say something, because it's a real milestone day and I'm a sentimental guy. I've built 41 bridges in this state. 41. He let that settle, and then he looked at her, and he was smiling, and his voice went soft and generous, which was how she knew what was coming. So when somebody comes out here and tells me my steel's wrong, I gotta be honest. I think about that. I've built 41 bridges." The laugh that time was bigger, not everyone, but bigger. Somebody handed her a plate. Somebody else, a foreman she never identified, put a bright orange sticker on the arm of her chair, the kind they hand out to children at the state fair booth, a cartoon hard hat with the words "Junior Safety Helper" around the brim. It got a second laugh. Delphine Achterberg peeled the sticker off with 2 fingers, folded it in half and put it in the chest pocket of her vest, where it stayed for 11 weeks. Then she ate the eggs, because they were free and she was hungry and she had a long day, and while she ate she looked past all of it, up at the underside of the 4th span, at the splice plates and the bolt heads catching the sun, thinking about zinc. Hot dip galvanizing is a beautiful process. You clean the steel in caustic, strip the scale in hydrochloric acid, flux it and dip it in molten zinc, and what comes out will not rust for 50 years. It is the right answer for 1,000 things. It is the wrong answer for an A490 bolt, and it has been the wrong answer since before Delphine Achterberg was born. An A490 is a quenched and tempered bolt with a minimum tensile strength of 150,000 pounds per square inch, and that strength is bought with hardness. Soak hard steel in acid and hydrogen, enters the metal, collects at the grain boundaries, and under sustained tension pries the grains apart from the inside. The bolt does not fail when you tighten it. It fails a week later, in the rain, at 3 in the morning, with nobody watching. The rule against putting zinc on an A490 has been in the specifications for 4 decades. You cannot see hydrogen, but you can see zinc, because zinc is silver and a bare A490 is dark, oiled, almost black. So on Friday, after the eggs, Delphine went back under the 3rd span alone. She worked the way she had worked for 17 years. She unrolled the tool roll on her lap, brass hammer, feeler gauges, a Zeiss lupe, a wire brush, a magnetic dry film thickness gauge, a portable hardness tester in a foam case, and 41 numbered evidence bags, because she had a system. She started with the gauge. She set it on 11 bolt heads at the Pier 3 flange splice, wiping each one first, taking 3 readings apiece. The gauge read between 2.1 and 2.6 mils. Zinc, 60 microns of it, on a bolt the contract said should have had none. Then she took out the hammer and sounded the joint, and she closed her eyes, and she went bolt to bolt across the bottom flange, splice, tap, listen, tap, listen, the flat click, the flat click, the flat click, and then, at the 4th bolt in from the west edge of the plate, a tick with a little life at the end of it. She marked it with a Kiel crayon. She kept going. She found 9 more. Then she found the empty holes. 2 of them, side by side, in the 2nd row of the Pier 3 top flange splice plate, visible from below only because she was below, and only because the sun sits at a particular angle at 9 in the morning in October. 2 holes with nothing in them, ringed with a smear of grey primer where somebody had touched up around the absence. And then, because she was sitting in the mud, at the elevation where things that fall from a bridge come to rest, she saw the bolt head. It was 11 feet from her right wheel, half sunk, silver on top and rust-stained below, and when she rolled to it and picked it up, she found it was not a bolt. It was the head of a bolt and 3/8 of an inch of shank, and the break was the ugliest thing she had seen in 11 years. There was no stretch in it, no necking, no cup, no sheer lip, no grey fibrous tearing. It was bright and faceted and clean, a mirror of tiny flat planes, the surface of something that had come apart along the boundaries between its own crystals without bending first. Brittle, intergranular, textbook, in the way that textbook photographs are always of somebody's worst day. It had failed at the fillet under the head, which is where an embrittled bolt fails. She sat there with it in her palm, in the mud, under 90 feet of fracture-critical steel, over 2 live railroad tracks, 6 weeks from a deck pour that would put 1,410 cubic yards of concrete on top of that connection, and she understood the entire shape of it at once. A 2-girder system, 2 lines of steel and nothing else, no third girder to catch the load, which is why the field splices at the piers were the most important 11 square feet on the project. At the piers, the deck sat in negative moment, the top flange in tension, pulled harder by every yard of concrete. And the top flange splice at Pier 3 had been bolted with galvanized A490s at unverified tension, was missing 2 bolts, and had already thrown 1 head into the mud. She wrote the time in her field book, 9:14. Then, under it, in the same handwriting she had used at 15, steel never lies. It just waits for somebody honest enough to look. Then she got on the phone. It took 11 days to build the case, and she built it the way you build a case that has to survive a hearing, a lawsuit, and a criminal referral. Which is to say, she built it out of other people's documents. She got the QC files, not from the truck in Fitchburg, which never came back, but through the district office, formally, in writing, with a date stamp on the request and a date stamp on the delay. 311 pages arrived on a Tuesday, and she read all of them in one sitting in a hotel room in Chelmsford. The mill test report for the bolt lot was for F3125 grade A325, hot dip galvanized, heat number 4L7719, from a distributor in Rhode Island. On the copy in the contractor's file, the line reading A325 had been altered to read A490 in a slightly different font, on a page photocopied 4 times to bury the seam. The original was findable, because it always is. The same report, same heat number, unaltered, sat in the submittal file for a parking structure in Providence that Trell Hallenbeck had built the year before, in the public record of a building department, and it cost her $11. The rotational capacity tests carried the signature of a bolting inspector named Curtis Pflum, 41 times across 5 months. His state qualification card had expired 14 months before the first signature. 3 reports were dated on Sundays. 9 were dated on days the gate log, kept by the contractor's own card reader, showed him nowhere on the property. The daily reports described match marking every tensioned bolt with a paint stripe across nut, bolt and plate, so a nut that backed off would show itself later as a broken line. When Delphine went back under span 3 with the loop, she found match marks painted over dirt. Not steel, dirt. You could see the crayons skipping across the grit. Somebody had walked that splice with a paint stick afterward and drawn the lines in. And on the 11th day, in the parking lot of a Dunkin' on Route 113, Teodoro Baldacchino handed her a page out of his field book. He had torn it out at the perforation, which she noticed and did not mention. It was dated the 9th of August. In his handwriting, 4 kegs bolts delivered Pier 3. Galvanized? Told me they're the same bolt. Told me to rewrite the page. Under it, in pencil, the version he had been told to file. 4 kegs bolts delivered Pier 3, per spec. I filed the second one, Teo said. He was looking at the steering wheel. She put the page in an evidence bag and wrote the date on the bag. Everybody who lets it go tells themselves the same story about the lease. You kept it. She pulled 3 bolts on the 16th, with the state resident engineer standing there as witness and a photographer from the district office documenting the removal, and she sent them to an independent metallurgical lab in Auburn with a chain of custody form. The results came back on the 22nd, 4 pages of it. Coating, zinc, hot dip, average 61 microns, hardness 40 and 41 on the Rockwell C scale, above the 38 maximum the standard allows. 2 of the 3 bolts contained pre-existing subsurface cracks at the head-to-shank fillet under magnetic particle inspection. The third fractured in direct tension at 41,000 pounds. The specified minimum pretension for that bolt is 80,000. The bolts holding the tension flange of a fracture-critical bridge over a commuter rail line were failing at half the load they were supposed to be sitting at, every day, all day, forever. Somewhere in the middle of those 11 days, Dorsey Hallenbeck made a phone call. He called the Foire, Massachusetts Division office in Cambridge to complain that a ride-along in a wheelchair was obstructing the progress of a federally funded project, and he asked to speak to whoever was in charge of her. He got Genevieve Lausier, who had been the division administrator for 9 years, and who let him talk for 4 uninterrupted minutes. "Mr. Hallenbeck," she said, when he was finished, "I want to make sure I understand." The line was quiet. "There's a document on the corkboard in your field office," Genevieve said, "pages 4 and 5. The public information meeting for the Vesey Narrows Bridge opening had been on the Kingsbridge town calendar since August. It was held on the last Thursday in October at 6 in the evening in the auditorium of the town hall, a 1911 building with a stage, a bad sound system, and 220 folding wooden seats. 141 people came. Half were residents who wanted to know when the detour would end. There were 2 selectmen, the mayor, the superintendent of schools, 3 men from the ironworkers local, the district highway director, the state resident engineer, Naomi Okafor, in the 3rd row with her recorder on the armrest, and, in the last row by the door, a man in a grey jacket who was not on the agenda, Detective Milo Strand, who worked construction fraud out of the Attorney General's office. Genevieve Lausier sat in the 2nd row with a folder on her knees and a fountain pen in her hand. Delphine Achterberg sat at the end of the front row, at the aisle, because there was no ramp to the stage, and she had decided that the absence of a ramp was going to be somebody else's problem tonight, rather than hers. Dorsey Hallenbeck went first. He had a slide deck and a lapel mic, and he was, as always, good at this part. He talked about the schedule and the weather days and the 28 local hires, thanked the town for its patience, and got a genuine round of applause when he said the detour would come off in December. "And to close out," he said, "my marketing gal put together a little video, 2 minutes." The lights went down. It was a good video. Drone footage over the river at sunrise, a girder swinging into place against a hard blue sky, a welder's arc in slow motion. It had music, and at 1 minute 50 it cut to the topping out breakfast, the evergreen on the top flange, 46 people with paper plates, the superintendent with a coffee raised, and the audio came up at 3 times the volume he had used when he said it. "I've built 41 bridges." And in the video, the crew laughed, and in the auditorium, nobody did. 220 wooden seats are a very quiet thing when nobody in them is moving. The video ran another 11 seconds, and the lights came up on a man standing at a podium in front of a town he had just informed, with his own footage of exactly who he was. "Actually," Genevieve Lausier said, standing, before questions. The state resident engineer had been waiting 9 weeks for somebody to ask him for something. Every weekly owner-contractor coordination call on the project was recorded as a matter of contract, and everybody on those calls knew it, or had been told, or had signed a page saying they had been told. He plugged a laptop into the podium. The audio was terrible, thin and boxy through the 1911 sound system, and it did not matter at all. There was a minute of scheduling, then a voice asking about the bolt delivery for Pier 3, and then Dorsey Hallenbeck's voice, unmistakable, patient, explaining it to a subordinate. "They're galvanized, they're fine. It's a stronger bolt than the drawing calls for. Nobody's ever had a problem." The resident engineer let 2 seconds of silence run, then advanced the file to a second clip from the 16th of October at 7:40 in the morning, and pulled the keys on the lift. Just pull 'em. He closed the laptop. Somebody in the third row said something under their breath. One of the iron workers stood up, looked at the stage for a moment, and sat back down. He did not sit down. He stood at the podium with both hands on it, and the bolt he always carried was in his right fist, and he did not walk it across his knuckles once for the rest of the evening. "I'd like to introduce Delphine Achterberg," Genevieve said. "She is a licensed professional engineer, the lead structures engineer for construction oversight in this division, one of 11 members of the National Fracture Critical Peer Review Panel, and the author of the technical procedure that governs field verification of bolted connections on every federal aid bridge in this Commonwealth, including this one." A pause, the kind she was known for. "There is no stage access, so she will speak from the floor." 141 people turned their chairs. Delphine did not use a podium and did not use slides. She had a wireless mic in one hand, a canvas tool roll in her lap, and a small brass hammer. "The bridge over your river is what we call a two-girder system," she said. 2 lines of steel and nothing else. Most bridges you drive on have 5 or 6, so if one cracks, the others carry the load until somebody finds it. This one has 2. We call that fracture critical." She held up an evidence bag. Inside it was a silver bolt head with 3/8 of an inch of shank. "I found this in the mud under your 3rd span on the 17th. It came out of a splice above 2 active commuter rail tracks. You can pass it down." It went down the front row and back through the 2nd and the 3rd, and 141 people held a piece of a broken bolt in their hands, and the room got very quiet and stayed that way. "The contract for this bridge requires a bolt called an A490, she said. "It's the strongest bolt in ordinary structural use, and it gets that strength from being hard. Hard steel has one enemy, and the enemy is hydrogen. Galvanizing starts with a bath in hydrochloric acid, and acid drives hydrogen into the metal, where it waits at the grain boundaries. That is why the standards have said, for 40 years, in one sentence, that you do not put zinc on an A490. It isn't a preference." She rolled the canvas out on her lap. "The bolts in your bridge are galvanized. I measured 61 microns of zinc. The laboratory measured a hardness of 41 Rockwell C, where the standard allows 38, which makes the hydrogen worse. 2 of the 3 bolts we pulled already had cracks under their heads. The third broke in a test frame at 41,000 pounds. She looked up. "In 3 weeks, you were scheduled to place 1,410 cubic yards of concrete on that deck. At the piers, that concrete pulls on the top flange." She lifted the bag. Then Delphine Achterberg did the thing that 141 people would remember for the rest of their lives, which had nothing to do with any of the numbers. She took 2 lengths of angle iron out of the tool roll, bolted together, and held them up beside the microphone. "My grandfather taught me this when I was 9, she said. She tapped it with the brass hammer, and the sound came through the speakers, flat and short and dead, a tooth on a tooth. She turned the assembly around. "This one is out of your Pier 3 splice." She tapped it, and the sound that came out of the 1911 sound system was a dull tick with a little ring at the end of it, hanging in the air of the auditorium for a half-second too long, and every single person in that room heard it and understood it, without one word of engineering. "Steel never lies," she said. The formal part took 4 minutes and had no drama in it at all, which is how the important parts of this work usually go. Genevieve Lozier read from a single page. Federal participation in the Vesey Narrows project was suspended as of that hour, pending a special inspection. The state's resident engineer issued a stop work order on all steel and deck operations at 8:11 that evening, from a folding chair with a pen borrowed from a selectman. Every bolt in the 3 pier splices, 1,412 of them, would come out and be replaced from a documented, uncoated lot under independent inspection. For 11 days afterward, trains ran under the 3rd span at restricted speed, while the splices were rebolted one connection at a time. Detective Milo Strand met the contractor's records custodian in the parking lot afterward and handed over a preservation notice for the QC files, the gate logs, the recorded progress calls, and the submittal correspondence. He was polite about it. He is always polite about it. The bridge opened on the 14th of March instead of the 9th of December. The rebolting, the delay, and the third-party inspection cost Trell Hallenbeck Constructors $2.1 million, none of which was reimbursable, because you do not get paid twice for the same connection. Curtis Flum, whose signature appeared on 41 inspection reports he had not performed, pleaded to falsifying records on a publicly funded project in a courtroom in Lowell before Judge Beatrice Souza, and lost his qualification permanently, and served 11 months of probation, and paid a fine he is still paying. Dorsey Hallenbeck was removed as general superintendent by his own family's firm within 48 hours, in a meeting that lasted, by his own later account, 6 minutes. He was not sent to prison. He entered an agreement barring him from supervising federally funded work for 5 years, paid restitution, and did 300 hours of community service at a vocational high school in Worcester, teaching sophomores to read a set of drawings. His firm avoided debarment by signing an administrative agreement requiring an independent quality monitor and field verification training for every superintendent and foreman on its payroll. There was no shouting scene. Nobody dragged him out of anything. He walked out of the town hall on the last Thursday in October through the same door he had walked in, past 141 people who did not look at him, and the hardest part of it, he would say later, was that not one person said a word. And in the spring, at the ribbon cutting, he read a statement. It was 6 sentences long, and he read it badly, in front of Naomi Okafor's recorder and 2 television cameras and the mother of a boy who rode the bus over that bridge. He said he had been wrong about the bolts, he said he had been wrong about the engineer, and that the second thing was the reason for the first, because a man who will not listen to somebody he has decided not to respect has already stopped being any good at building things. Then he stepped back and took no questions. Delphine Achterberg was not on the platform. She was under the 3rd span with a brass hammer, sounding the new splice, 1 bolt at a time, with her eyes closed. She was offered 3 jobs that year. A design firm in Boston offered her triple her salary to serve as an expert witness. She turned all 3 down, and she also turned down a settlement that would have paid her personally for the 11 weeks of what her attorney wanted to call harassment and what she preferred to call Tuesday. What she took instead was a line item. The administrative agreement that kept Trell Hallenbeck in business required funded field verification training, and there was nowhere in the Commonwealth that taught it as a trade rather than a seminar. So she wrote a 4-page proposal, made a nuisance of herself for 11 months, and the following February, the Anselm Achterberg Center for Field Verification opened in a leased machine shop on Depot Street, 4 blocks from the river, with $340,000 in program money and a used forklift. It was accessible before it was anything else, and not by retrofit. No thresholds, 36-inch aisles between the mock-ups, benches at 30 inches with clear knee space, tool cribs with everything below 54, a mock deck with a lift instead of a ladder, and a bathroom a person could turn around in. When the foreman told her the aisles were wasted floor space, she asked him where he'd like the coffee machine, at 40 inches or at 60. They teach a 2-day course: bolting, splices, coatings, mill certs, chain of custody, and how to write a field note that will still mean something in a courtroom 4 years later. Every student is handed a small brass hammer on the first morning, and the first lesson is not a lecture. It is a length of angle iron across two sawhorses, one bolt at tension and one backed off half a turn, and 40 minutes of listening with their eyes closed. Nobody leaves without hearing it. On the back wall there is a glass case with 41 fractured bolts in it, each one on a card with a project name and a date, and one sentence about what it did. The bolt head from the mud, under span 3, is in the middle of the second row. Teodoro Baldacchino teaches Tuesdays and Thursdays. He makes 26-year-olds keep their field books properly, and he tells the story about the page he tore out and kept, every cohort, always at the same point on the second afternoon. 11 scholarships a year go to workers coming back into the trades after an injury, which is a group every training program in the country claims to want, and almost none of them build a door for. In the third cohort, in the fall, there was a man in the back row who had signed the roster as D. Hallenbeck, in handwriting nobody could read, and who came in 10 minutes early and sat down without talking to anyone. His 5-year bar had 4 years left on it. His firm's agreement required the training, and there was exactly one place in the Commonwealth to get it. Delphine handed out the hammers. When she got to the back row, she held one out, and he took it and looked at it in his palm for a second longer than anybody else had. He asked. It was not a joke, exactly. He was not smiling. "Bear," she said. Then she went back to the front of the room and started the way she always started, which was with a 9-year-old girl in a driveway in Fall River and a grandfather who did not have a warm word in him and gave her the only one she ever needed. "Steel never lies," she told them. "It just waits for somebody honest enough to look. That used to mean we'd find out eventually. Now it means you. Man, imagine spending 31 years being the guy who knows everything and then finding out that the one person you refused to look at was the only one who could have saved you. Imagine what she heard in that mud and what it cost her to keep listening. If this one got you, hit that like button. It helps the channel more than you'd think. Share it with somebody who's been underestimated at work, because they'll know exactly which part hit. And if you're new here, subscribe. I've got a lot more stories like this one coming. So tell me in the comments, have you ever been the person nobody listened to, right up until they had to? I read every single one.